it's my delightful job to introduce this evening's speaker, because he's an old friend, and because I think he's a remarkable guy. There are some people who kind of figure out one place or another to fit themselves in the art world, you know, like collector, dealer, critic, scold, character. And there's some people who manage to figure out how to be in all those places and play all those positions. And tonight, we're lucky to have as our speaker, Kenny Schachter, a man who's, well, let's see, a lawyer at one point in his life. And he got smart and gave that up. An artist, a dealer, alternative space, ran an alternative space, ran a really cool gallery in London for a long time. Is one of the people who understands the connections between architecture and art in a way that very few people do. And really knows a lot about cars also. Really knows a lot about cars, which is kind of cool. But he's got an attitude and an idea about the art world that I find refreshing. I don't always agree with everything he says or thinks, but I find it incredibly important to hear from somebody who's really got an overview, both as a collector, as an artist, as a curator, and as somebody who takes the art world seriously, but also sees how totally screwed up it is in so many ways. So without any further ado, I introduce to you tonight's speaker, Kenny Schachter.
Wait till you hear me speak before you clap. May disappoint you. So I am pretty much most of those things that David mentioned. We once even lectured 1,000 years ago about the Whitney Biennial when you were the head of the Whitney, some light years ago. So the talk that I'll give to you, the presentation is broken into two parts. And the first part is just really how I got to be sitting here tonight from an alienated kid in the suburbs of Long Island, stuttering and cutting out pictures of magazines and sticking them to my corkboard in my bedroom, and to speaking here and about just the kind of nature of the projects I do, etc. So I'm starting with, this is a joke about, everyone I'm sure knows who Jerry Saltz is, and he's a dear friend who I've known for 30 years. I've been doing this for about 30 years in one capacity or another, and he recently wrote an article, 33 Rules to be an Artist, which I find a little bit amusing because he's not an artist, he's a critic. And he tried to be an artist, but in any event, and now he's even fleshed that out and turned it into a book, which he's touring. But for me, there are no rules to be an artist, and that's part of the reason why I found art so appealing in the first instance, even though I found it to be a much more conservative environment than even the law profession was at a certain point. So again, just a little background, I studied philosophy in school. There were no jobs for philosophy, and I went to law school no intent to practice law ever. I did it part-time in the end. I took the bar exam in '87. That's how ancient I am. And I actually have a lecture at my old law school tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning for the Art Appraisers Association of America, which is kind of horrifying, not only because it's at 9 o'clock in the morning, but I actually had to go there and do some research for the first time in 1,000 years. And while I was in law school, I took a drawing class, I took a sculpture class, and those are really the first art classes that I had ever taken. After law school, I wasn't even aware that art galleries existed or the art world, even though I had gone to museums during the course of my college education. And then I wanted to do so, I basically defined my career in the early stages, and even today, in this kind of, I'm not a strictly negative person. I think of myself as kind of cynically idealistic, but I defined my career basically about what I didn't want to do. So I didn't want to do anything in the law profession. That was clear from the start. I even told my family that I was in night school and there was no night school, and I started working in a bunch of different fields. So I ended up, I wanted to do something that was creative and that was entrepreneurial. I didn't know the art business as a business even existed, that art was bought or sold. I thought that it immediately went from an artist's studio so naively, like an idiot savant, mostly the idiot. I thought it went directly into a museum from an artist's studio, and then I started working. I literally took the bar exam, and it takes 3 months to find out whether you passed or not. I made a resume and then handed it out to 300 businesses in the garment district because I thought I would, one of my kids, last one to show up, if I can't embarrass my kids, there's no point of this whole exercise, is there? So I literally handed out my resume into 300 offices and got a job for a tie designer, selling ties like Willy Loman, carrying these gigantic suitcases around the East Coast and fanning them out in these mom and pop menswear stores trying to sell them. And then a few things happened to transform my career in a sense. One of them was finding out about Vito Acconci and his piece in particular, Seabed, where he famously masturbated under the floor of Sonnabend Gallery in 1972. During the course of a show, he would go in there for about 3 or 4 hours a day and please himself. And I thought, wow, that's something that I could do, and I could relate to that. Maybe I could be warming up to something as a career. Then again, I was like, the tie business, aside from the fact that I was allergic to silk, and I was selling silk ties for a job, which didn't go very well, and the guy who owned the company turned out to be a manic, obsessive gambler who was about to go to jail. And before he did, I rubbed the ties all over my face to get an allergy attack and extricate myself from this hideous job of carrying around these suitcases in Ohio and all along the East Coast. And I would be trying to sell these ties, and I would see a sign of an airplane and literally just divert, because I would always get lost and drive to the airport and go home with a complete unsuccess story, which became the name of an exhibition that I curated. But then I was procrastinating between jobs. I actually found out that I passed the bar exam. And when Andy Warhol died in 1988, there was an estate sale at Sotheby's of his stuff. And at that point in time, I had seen Warhol's paintings. I wasn't a tremendous fan of his, but it was something to do. A friend dragged me to the sale at Sotheby's. And rather than just seeing a bunch of Warhol paintings, in the sale was his art collection. And he had traded with Basquiat, and he had traded with David Hockney and Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, and he had cookie jars, and he had watches, and he was basically like a shopaholic, but he had one hell of an incredible art collection. And this was back in '88, and at that time, they were gearing up every 2 times a year in New York. They have major auctions. So the auctions now are coming up at Sotheby's, Christie's, and Phillips, and they have previews every season. So right now the previews are up, and I always recommend, one of the greatest places to experience art, believe it or not, is in an auction room before the sales. They're open to the public, and I wildly emphasize the fact that you should go this weekend. Go to Phillips, go to Christie's, go to Sotheby's. You can get up close. They don't look you up and down like when you go to a gallery and try to make these determinations and pigeonhole you into what you are and what you aren't. But you could touch the art if you're so inclined, which I often was, getting into trouble a lot, still am. And anyway, I went to the Sotheby's sale of Warhol's estate, and there was this incredible art collection. I mean, there were Basquiats at the time in 1988 that sold for $25,000 that today could be worth upwards of $100 million. And that really wasn't what interested me so much. It was just the fact that they were getting ready for a May sale, and all of the art that I had seen at the East Wing of the Smithsonian in Washington, all of these pieces by people like Warhol and the people that I just mentioned were being set up for an auction, and I just couldn't believe the fact that these things were bought and sold. From there, I saw an ad in a newspaper and went to Herschel and Adler Gallery, where they had an exhibition of Cy Twombly prints. And this was the first time I didn't even know that galleries existed. And I went into the gallery, and I was flabbergasted that you could actually buy this stuff and live with it in your home and rub your nose against it. And I started out commercially, I immediately jumped into dealing in prints and drawings. And I had passed the bar. I took a part-time job in a law firm after I ran away from the tie business. And I walked into a bank, and I said I would like $10,000 to buy some art. And they turned their head sideways like a dog does when it doesn't understand the command, and they thought I was absolutely mad. And I got a loan. They turned me down for the loan. I had a part-time job for a law firm, and they called the bank. I got the $10,000, and immediately I started dealing to other dealers by buying art. And it was a way just for me to live with the art, to access the art. And in a sense, it's what I don't sell art to collectors because I just don't have the personality and I don't have the patience. You could see that I'll rifle through all these slides and go really quickly, but I'm mostly even today, commercially, I sell art to make a living. I'm selling my own work as well, but I'm always been like a dealer to dealer. And in a way, it's I love art dealers because art dealers make a leap of faith. Most of them are failed artists, and they love art, they know about art, and I can't explain, I can't sell drugs to a drug addict, I always say. because really I feel incapable of trying to explain to someone why they should like something or not like something. And I think because of the fact that I came from outside the art system, I never knew like what you weren't supposed to do or what you weren't supposed to know. So when I first went into art galleries, I was just absolutely shocked. I mean, I was 27 years old. I had never been to a commercial gallery before. And again, like you see a uniform clinical architectural model the world over. No matter where you go into a gallery, in South America, North America, Asia, Europe, they're all the same, 4 white walls. They have this terrible kind of mindset attitude where they look you up and down and look at your shoes, and you try to, I mean, it's funny, I was just giving a lecture I've been teaching in the graduate school at the University of Zurich for 8 years now, and I just taught a class on Saturday, and after the lecture, we went to visit some galleries, and we went to Herschel Adler, we went to Hauser and Wirth, and a new incarnation of the former, and you can't even get the price. Like, again, you go up to the desk and you ask someone for the price of a painting, and they won't even tell you what the price is. And in New York, it's actually the law that either the price is on the wall, which you'll never see, or it's meant to be legally, they're obligated statutorily to have the price on the desk. And again, no galleries have that. I see a couple of people here that work in galleries, and I'm not going to go as far as asking them in particular if their gallery puts the prices on the desk. But again, like, so the woman from the gallery was explaining some of the art to us, and I said, how much does that cost? And she kind of froze and freaked out, and she couldn't even tell me how much the damn painting cost. And these are meant to be like places where they sell stuff, and they make everything so difficult. So I just couldn't believe that this was kind of the way in which galleries function on a uniform basis. So I started organizing. It was even before like pop-ups. We used to call them like hit and run spaces. There wasn't even the term pop-up in the vocabulary. That's how ancient I am. And I started to organize these shows and really just kind of like learning about art through artists and going to schools, meeting a few people at the time from Rhode Island School of Design, and then meeting their friends and just incessantly putting myself out there to work with artists. And then there was a huge recession at the time in New York in 1990, 1991, and I would trade art for spaces and just put together these shows. Mainly I was making art sort of amateurishly, as I still am and did then, and I would always sort of stick my art in the show, and it was a way to put my stuff in the context of my peers, many of which were very talented, and it was a great opportunity for me. But this was one of the first shows I curated. It was a show about, I mean, now we're stifled by political correctness in the art environment or in the world at large. And it was just sort of trickling down into the creative industries at the time. There was a famous Whitney Biennial in the early 90s that was all political art. And now you look back nostalgically or affectionately to such a time, and now it's more like fascistic in a certain sense. But I did an exhibition based on like political incorrectness, and this was artist Devin DeCue. She was serving roast beef sandwiches, like blood red raw roast beef dripping down people's faces, and that was her sculpture. And if you give anything away for free in the art world, people will grab it. This was another show, again, like called Unlearning. I remember studying in philosophy, they had these people that lived, peasants that lived in Afghanistan in the mountains, had never been to a classroom in their life and learned like 300 pages of the Quran word by word. And I called the show Unlearning because it was a way like what I felt that I was doing, and I still am today. Everything is sort of a reaction in a sense. The art that I make, the writing that I write, it's sort of this unlearning process, because the art world, it's amazing. You hear so much with Donald Trump and all this political bullshit about like fake news, but the art world, I was giving a talk in Chicago about, they wanted me to speak on fake news in art journalism, and it occurred to me when I was just wrestling with something to say that the art world loves lies. It's the truth that makes everybody nuts in the art world. It's when you actually name names and explain really how the machinations of the market are and how things actually work. So this show was called Unlearning. I showed the work for the first time of Rachel Harrison, who has a retrospective, mid-career retrospective survey show that just opened at the Whitney. And I always included, I can never understand why you go to exhibitions and there's video art and there's text art, but there's never a place to sit down and like look at a video that some cases, like with Matthew Barney, can go on for like 30 or 40 minutes. So I would always incorporate chairs, simple elements to make the spaces more humanistic than the typical 4 white walls that you would go see. And again, like I could teach anyone post-war art in a matter of months. really, I guess few people professionally take the time to read anymore in the art world. Everyone has such a kind of Instagram-defined attention span. And I couldn't bear the thought after law school of going back to school. So I started teaching at the New School in '92, and I've been teaching ever since. I was so nervous in the very beginning that I would drink like a giant bottle of beer before I would give a lecture. I was so petrified. And I was hired, because I never studied art, I had gone to graduate school, so I got hired on probation at the New School. And then the dean who hired me for 6 lectures left, and I was in the books as an adjunct professor, and I ended up giving lectures at Columbia, at Rhode Island School of Design, and all over the world, and still teach all the time. And to me, it's just a great aspect of what I do as a practice. Really, I do it as much for myself because of the discipline. And you know, it's one thing to go to exhibitions and to go to art fairs and auctions and all of these things that I do, but when I write about it and when I teach about it, it creates a whole other dimension of me trying to learn more and think more about all of these different parts of the art world. So basically, this is what I'm doing now. That's actually my email address. And it's, again, like, I mean, the art world is a very exclusionary environment to live in and to work in. I mean, by nature, you're selling things that are generally very, very, very expensive. You're selling to a very small group of people. At the same time, galleries are the only free lunch in town, where to this day, you can go see most exhibitions for free. In Europe, in the UK, where I lived for 15 years, museums are mostly free. And it's very important to me to have this kind of democratic notion of what I do. So even though I've bought and sold art, I've sold a Cézanne painting and Miro and Picasso and all of these works. I mean, a lot of the stuff, I live with posters and prints. They're very accessible and people can get involved for such a little amount of money. All you ever hear about in the newspapers, oh, when a painting sells for $450 million. But it's so important to me to be, if anyone has a question down the line, if I could be of help in any way, I'm like, there's my email, use it, or DM me on Instagram, where, as my kids will attest, I'm way too frequently using Instagram all the time, because it's really changed my life in a really meaningful and impactful way, which I'll get into a little bit more. But again, like the art world, I remember when I was a lawyer and I wanted to go into the art world, and you think from outside, you think of Van Gogh, or you think of artists drinking absinthe and going wild and having great parties. And then when I get into the art world, it was more conservative than the brief period of time I worked in law firms. So I curated a show at PS1 back in '92, and I was doing these hit and run shows, about 4 or 5 shows a year, and working with a lot of unaffiliated artists. It was very important to me to work with artists that had not had any entree into the system, into the gallery system at all. And I mean, there was a point, like at this period in '92, I mean, people talk about the recession in 2008 and in the art market. And I mean, the art market has grown so exponentially, which I'll get into a little bit more. But there was a dry spell in the market from like 1990 to 1995 or 96, where there were no galleries that would entertain even looking at slides by artists, except for one extraordinary art dealer. His name was Hudson, and his gallery was Feature. And not only would he look at the slides that you sent them, because before Instagram and the internet, that was the only way that you could communicate images, he would actually write critiques of every single person's slides that he would get, which was quite extraordinary. But literally, most galleries would just throw them in the garbage as soon as they would get them. And I remember doing studio visits in Brooklyn where people would just come out of the street and thrust their slides in my hand when I was walking around to give visits. This was a show I curated, Morality Cafe, about ethics in the art world, or rather the lack of it. That's a piece by Rachel, The Sticks, hanging off the wall. That's in the Whitney exhibition now. There's another piece by Christian Schumann in the back. This was a very young artist who shot up to fame early on. He was one of the youngest artists ever in the Whitney Biennial. But again, like, you hear all the success stories in art, but there's just as many stories of artists that don't succeed. It's such a hard and competitive and difficult environment to this day, even though it's grown so much. So Christian at one point was hailed by Roberta Smith she compared him to Northern Renaissance painting and said he gives hope to the state of painting in the art world. And then his career went kind of up to here and then down to somewhere else. Again, these are all spaces. I would trade stuff when I had no money to get spaces. And this was another show, I Was Born Like This. In a sense, like, you don't really choose. I mean, you're born to make art and to be in the art world, whether the opportunities are there or not. And that's why, like, during a recession and when the opportunities are fewer, people come out of the woodwork and do great things. And all during the course of the time. I mean, during this period where I was curating these shows, there was no art market the way we speak about it today. There was really, no one would even hold out the hope that you can somehow become independently wealthy from selling your own pieces. It never even occurred to anybody at the time. But this was the invitation that I made, and that was like a person carrying around the suitcases like Willy Loman in Death of a Salesman. It was more meant to be like a self-portrait because it was so hard to make a living. And really, after 30 years, I have to say it still is tremendously difficult, even though the opportunities have grown. And that big wall, which is made out of like a kind of quilt of discarded shards of sheetrock by Rachel Harrison, we actually threw that piece away. And if you go to the Whitney today, there's a big mural on the wall because that's all that remains of that piece that we just didn't have the money to store or to keep at the time. And during these shows, I would sell, in the beginning, I sold one of my own pieces in one of the first shows that I curated, which was simply a recording of like these breaks of garbage trucks, which sounded like prehistoric animals. And I sold it to an independent art advisor called Theo Westreich. And at the time, this was back in '91, I thought that I was going to be an art star and this was going to be the easiest thing. And I mean, my career at that time when the market was strong, I ended up making like 100,000 one year buying and selling art, and the next year it was down to like below 15,000, to the point I had to lie to my family how much I was earning so they wouldn't throw me out and try to force me to stop working in the art world, which actually happened. In 1996, I did a museum show in Texas. That's another Rachel Harrison work. Ricky Albender is in the background. Then in the mid-'96, I showed the work of Cecily Brown. They were $1,200 a painting in another hit and run show. I mean, today her auction record is at like $6.7 million. And even then, I couldn't give her work away for $1,200. You could see an example of how truly bad I am at selling art. This was another show in '97 where I was able to get a Rockefeller-supported grant to work with Mexican and American artists. And I curated shows in Mexico City. And again, like this is a space when the art world, it's incredible. The contemporary art world was in the East Village, where the galleries started to accumulate. And then they started to move to Soho in the '70s with Paula Cooper, and then younger galleries like Pat Hearn and American Fine Art. And then it's incredible to think that, like, for me, there was, Gavin Brown is a great art dealer. He's kind of a friend of mine, frenemy. And I remember he used to curate these hit and run shows, and they would be like on the 50th floor of an office building. And he would say, if I can get 50 of the right audience, that would be enough for me. And I just remember always thinking, I'd rather have 5,000 of the wrong audience to come and see a show. And in this show, you could see like there's plastic hanging down from the wall. All the doors were kept open during like December and January. And literally I was freezing for 2 years after the show. I had such a chill through my bones, and never would put the word gallery on the wall, because things were really different then. Now, everyone wants to be an artist, which I'll get into a little bit more, celebrities and fashion people. But back then, it was pretty bleak and grim. I mean, you'd have openings with some warm beer, 6 psychopaths from the street would come in for the booze, a couple of art people, mostly artists, and that was pretty much the extent of it. In that show in '97, I showed the work of Wade Guyton, who's another artist who's sort of like taken off from Warhol and Christopher Wool in the use, going from silkscreen to using computer technology to make kind of aesthetically beautiful paintings made by Epson printers. His auction record is over $6 million today. Then after I had a grant from Mexico, I basically used the grant application as a boilerplate, and I just substituted different countries' names in. And even though I was basically for profit in intent, but it never really worked out that way, so I consider myself sort of not for profit by default. But I was able to get all of these grants, even though I was an independent curator trying to make a living. So I had a Portuguese grant where they sent me to Lisbon to look at artists and organize shows, and that helped to pay for this one. I had a private grant. I went to London and did the show I Hate New York. And maybe in spite of it or because of it, I ended up getting robbed in the middle of the show, thrown down the stairs and locked in a closet where they stole my computer. And I was doing an art piece where I had it when the internet was just coming out at the time, and just the kind of like broadband was just really coming out in a more widespread way. There was a TV camera that was trained on me, and it was not on the seat across from me. And again, like everything about what I do is this kind of critique of the commercial dissemination of art. So at this point, I was trying to like divulge, put a camera on people and to reveal the conversations of what would happen when you're trying to sell something. And the conversations that you have, which haven't really changed ever. And then two guys came in. I asked them to come in front of my camera. They asked me to come in the back of the space. And then I was explaining a video and they proceeded to lock me into a chokehold. And I thought my explanation wasn't all that good, but it didn't deserve me being choked and thrown down the stairs like I was and locked in the closet. But then I kind of railed against galleries from the onset of my career, but Vito Acconci, from the masturbation phase to his performative work, and then he started doing design work, and then full-on architectural work. So I had tried to contact Vito for 10 years to put his art into an exhibition, and he never so much as acknowledged my existence until I read in a magazine interview that he was doing architecture, and he was having such a difficult time that he would settle for like doing a bathroom in someone's house. And I called him up, left him a message to design a space, even though it was the last thing that I wanted. And then like within 10 minutes, he called me back and he was on my couch in my house a day later, and he designed an exhibition space for me. And it was meant to be temporary, but his design entailed like 20,000 pounds of steel. And I told him to use as a jumping off point a gallery that Peggy Guggenheim opened in 1942 called Art of the Century, designed by Frederick Kiesler, who was another one of these hybrid figures in the art world where he was an architect, he was an artist and a designer. He designed storefronts and the Dome of the Book in Jerusalem, and also shop fronts, movie theater. So Vito designed these mesh metal walls. This was a desk that sort of everything sort of sprang from the front door of the space and snaked inside the space. And you could lift up elements in the wall because Kiesler designed a furniture element that had 18 different functions to it. It was a pedestal, it was a storage device, it was a seat, and all of these other things, a table. So really in the wall, you could lift up elements of the wall and make seats out of them or pedestals. There was a drop-down video screen. There you see the front desk pivoted. The front door jutted out of the space on an angle. And there I showed the first show of Joe Bradley. Again, my prowess as an art dealer again reared its head, and I couldn't give his work away either, not for $1,000. He's another one whose market really escalated quickly, but you could see that we would hang paintings on this metal mesh wall with hooks. This was a show by Brian Balat, who's now showing quite a bit. This was his first exhibition, and I showed people like Catherine Bernhard and various other artists. Then I started to do some art fairs at the time as well, and this was a show where I had Vito to design this armature. So instead of just utilizing, when you go to there's so many art fairs today, which I'll get into in a bit, if you're not all sleeping by then, and there's all uniform. 3 walls, 3 white walls make a cube from which they show the work. And here Vito designed this kind of freestanding armature in 2004 to hang the art on the armature. And then I ended up getting thrown out of the art fair because the people that ran the fair were complaining that his installation was sort of cutting off the access from one side of the space to the other. Then I got so bored of the art world in around 2007, when I had already moved to the UK, I started working with design more, and merely for the fact that it was just more interesting to me and less commercially oriented. And I forged a relationship with Zaha Hadid. This is a car she designed for me, and I curated exhibitions for her all over the world at Sonnabend Gallery. And I love the fact that it was kind of in this blurred area, because again, the art world is like you're a painter or you're a sculptor or you're a video artist. I remember when I was doing a critique in the graduate department at Rhode Island School of Design, the sculpting students couldn't get access to the darkroom to develop photographs they wanted to incorporate into their pieces. And it was such a backwards and conservative way of thinking. And I just, like again, by not differentiating between a car, a fork, a knife, a seat, a painting, I just think that the hierarchies that is so overwhelming in the art world are stultifying, and it should be more open-ended. And I commissioned Zaha to make these installations that were non-functional. Some of them weren't functional, but it was a great relationship that we had that lasted for years until she passed away prematurely. And I had always been writing, but there was no audience. No one ever read what I wrote, ever, basically, except for like 5 or 6 people. And then ArtNet, where I used to write in the 90s my editor was Walter Robinson, who you may know his paintings. He shows a great deal now. I mean, he got fired. They basically, none of these, you probably heard or know about all the art-oriented internet sites, ArtNet and Artsy and Paddle8 and none of them have ever made any money, and in all probability, none of them ever will. they don't really offer anything that you can't find like on Instagram. And Instagram, again, I'll keep referring to it, but it was never meant to be a fine art tool or commercial tool in the fine art context, but it's democratized in such a revolutionary way, the way that you communicate about art. And they actually, from one day to the next, they closed down the magazine because, of course, it's been a sink black hole for losing money, and still is in all probability. But in around 2011-12, I was asked to write. They started it again after they closed it. When Walter Robinson got fired, from one day to the next, they locked him out of his office, and then he started painting again because he had been a painter before he was the editor of ArtNet when they started it, and he became quite a successful artist by nature of the fact he got fired from his editorship. But then I was asked, the difference in when I was asked to write again was this, again, the technology had changed so fundamentally. And then all of a sudden I found the fact that my audience was growing, and in a way I created a platform, because making art, like from when I was cutting the pictures out of magazines and sticking them with pins onto my cork wall in the suburbs of Long Island, really I continued to do that throughout my whole life, and I would just do it for myself, like I've done most things in my career. And with the writing, I started to make my own art pieces, like Photoshop and short narrative video pieces that I would embed right into the article. So this was a piece where I heard that the Salvador Mundi painting that sold for 450 million, I made a kind of jokey fake Kusama room out of it. But I found out that it was being stored on his $550 million yacht floating somewhere around in the Middle East, and did this article, and then this is a video I made that accompanied. So, excuse me, indulge me. But in any event, like, I started doing this, and then back to like telling the truth in a way. And because I've been dealing art, making art, and just by sheer nature of doing this for so long, I had access to a lot of information of what was happening commercially in the art world, and started writing about it more and more. And the audience grew, and I continued to critique it because, again, like, divulge a lot of the information of what was happening. This was a joke I made about Hauser and Wirth is now like in the hotel business, in the restaurant business. They have a farm, and I thought, like, what's next in old age home where they feature their artists? And like this goes back to the first image that I showed when I said that there are no rules in the art world. So literally, it's like you can't decide to write a hit song or to be a famous anything or actor or whatever. You really, the one thing that's kept me going, and that's like the perseverance and passion for what I do. And I'll get to, like, when I get to the commercial half of this talk, it gets pretty damn depressing, and I'm stuck in the middle of some commercial nightmare right now, which with someone who used to be a very close friend of mine and an associate who like did something quite extraordinarily naughty, which I will talk about. But it gets pretty depressing. But because there are no rules, you invent your own life, you know, in the art world, and that really remains for me the best part of it. And even though, like, I write about the commercial side of the art world, I talk about it, I make pieces that critique it, but at the same time, I started out in drawings and works on paper, and every day of my life, living with art. I mean, in a way, I'm like I'm materialistic, because this is a materialistic world that we create objects in. And at the same time, I don't get, like, I consider myself to be very aesthetic at the same time. So I'm filled with contradictions personally and in my life, but I love art so much, but I don't get attached per se to individual objects. But just the fact of waking up in the morning and rubbing my nose against a drawing or looking closely at a painting is like reading a book. And in my most despondent, depressive times, it really still gives me great hope and inspiration, and that just doesn't change. So because of the nature of, the more I started to tell these stories of these things that were happening, which nobody once spoken about, people would call me up from all over and feed me these stories. And I had one person in particular who I called Deep Pocket, who was, as like a kind of joke, and was giving me all this secret inside information. So then I got a call from someone that some paintings had been damaged in the middle of the FIAC Art Fair. And not only did I write about it, but to make matters worse for the gallery, a certain little gallery called Gagosian that happened to have sold these pieces by Olivier Mosset. And this is a little short video I made about the incident. So they have birds flying around in the Grand Palais. It's actually the case during the art fair. But this painting had been damaged by a drunken person, these paintings by Olivier Mosset, and they had been, and I wrote this, and then I remember like every time I write an article, I run. I sort of hide under my bed and don't answer the phone for 2 days because there's always, I mean, I've had literally lawsuits threatened against me, although I've never been sued. I've had death threats against me from various people. And I've had, in one instance, one of my kids literally dove in and stopped someone from punching me in the face. And this is all due to the fact that I tell the truth about these things that people just don't want told and don't want known. And in this case, I was walking down the street and I did pick up the phone, and it was the director of Gagosian's gallery saying to me in no uncertain terms, that didn't happen. That painting didn't get damaged. And what they did is they just did a quick fix on the painting and they had sold it. So I said, well, it did happen because I know it happened, and someone even sent me a picture after the fact of this damaged painting. So like, not only did I write about it, but then I make a little silent video about it to drive home the point and add the bird poop element to it. But after the phone call by the director of the gallery, I had a phone call from the person who bought the painting, and they had no idea this even happened. That's the nature of the world that we live in, that this world is so kind of sleazy to this day. And you hear a lot of stories about like how the art world is unregulated. And I have to say, like, I'll get into it in this kind of very depressing commercial talk, which things will shift over to in a few seconds. But it just gets worse and worse. I mean, the more the money grows and the more the opportunities are, in a way, like back to Instagram, like it's okay, I'll get into it. Anyway, so just based on the writing, like there's another guy who's another little younger version of me, Joel Messler. He has a gallery in Long Island, but he's also a painter. He has a gallery called Rental. He's had a gallery in New York with Zach Freuer. And based on the writing, and because I was, for all intents and purposes, I was having like these miniature one-person shows every month where I would make these 2D collages and I would make these stupid videos and then write an article, and then everyone's reading it because they all want to know who's zooming who and what all the gossip is. So Joel offered me like this kind of tongue-in-cheek fake retrospective in Long Island, just not this summer, but the preceding summer. And this was a video I made to go along with the show. Just to stop right there, in the beginning, this is actually another video I made where during the Basel Art Fair, all the galleries that you see, like even like Pace just spent $125 million opening a new gallery, but there's like 16,000 square feet of public space and like 1 million square feet of private showing space where all the business transpires. And in the Basel Art Fair, this is another video within a video, but they have a lot of private viewing space that's not the public booths of the fair. So then I get a little secret call from someone saying that one crate fell over, that hit another crate, and like a bunch of dominoes, all the crates fell over and damaged all of these works. So that's actually... And then again, I have the people from the fair telling me that that never happened.
Oh my God! No way! Oh my!
So I mean, it's like a joke again. And I think for me, humor is like an access point into art. And there's not, a lot of people, most people don't share this idea, but I mean, there are artists like Franz West that incorporated humor into their work. And for me, I just think like things should be entertaining on a certain level and appeal more to just a bunch of erudite people trying to make money off the back of all of this. So this was really a kind of video piece that accompanied the one-person show because in a sense, I was being reborn as an actual practicing artist. And this was an installation, the first one I did, where I took, I mean, for this lecture, yesterday I spent like 9 hours working on this presentation, and then I erased the entire file by accident. But typical of me. When you write an article, like these articles, I get paid $1,000 to write an article for Artnet. And I used to get paid $1,500, and they reduced my fee. But it takes all of about 20 to 25 hours to write an article, and then within 24 hours it's gone. And even though like you could look up pretty much every article I've written in the past 10 years, it has a shelf life of carbon-14 on the internet, but the article goes up on the first page of the website and then it's gone in 5 seconds. So I made this kind of installation with various excerpts from from a group of articles that I had written. Then there's sculpture and videos that were in the show. And I did it, like I basically, from the very first time where I started to have these very, very unsuccessful exhibitions, I learned to have expectations of less than zero, which is what I had when I did this show. And again, like I think the most important thing as an artist, as a profession, as someone who aspires to have a career in the arts, you really have to prepare yourself for the worst case scenario and just expect nothing other than trying to be a better artist. And I wasn't expecting anything commercially, and I ended up selling a good deal of art to some very good people, and the show was reviewed. So in spite of my ridiculousness, there's hope. Then these were photographs relating, we did a book, there was some merch. Then this was another show in Los Angeles, which I did in a space where I just pitched it to someone who's mostly a private dealer, but he has this, like only in LA, he has like a miniature fake gallery in his house, and it's like a cement box. It's meant simply to photograph well for Instagram, so he could present it like a real gallery, but it's only like a little closet or stage set. And I just asked him if I could have an exhibition during Frieze Art Fair, which just had an inaugural fair in LA last year. And now, believe it or not, I'm having a show in Tokyo at Blum & Poe Gallery in the spring, one of the very best galleries, which shows that there's hope for anybody if I can manage something like that. Then I've done various books curatorially. There was a Paul Thek book that I did an exhibition, that I helped the Reina Sofia do an exhibition. I advised the Whitney on a Paul Thek show in 2011. Vito Acconci, we did a book with Springer Verlag. I published a book with Gerhard Richter and Sigmar Polka and did an exhibition at Christie's at the time. Nuclear Family was a show I did with my kids, which I'll talk about more. There was etc. This Jasper Who, where this images with the text, was back in the year 2000. I mean, I had been traveling in Europe and seeing, like, in a culture like the UK, everyone knew who Tracy Emin was, or mainly because she got like throw up drunk on television and made a fool of herself. But people knew about Damien Hirst before he was the giant commercial success that he is today. So in a way, like, art communicated to various layers of culture in a way it never did in the US. And I remember, like, in the year 2000, like, Matthew Barney was the most well-known artist of his generation, having a retrospective at the Guggenheim, and no one knew even who he was, because art communicated with such a small group of people. And partly it's because the art world's always been trying to paint itself into this, you know, it could only be known by a few people. It's very expensive, so it's not for everybody. The art world, I was saying before, it literally moved from Soho when there was 300 or 400 galleries. I remember Andrea Rosen first moved, and Pat Hearn and Matthew Marks, and they moved to Chelsea because there was no access from public transportation. So when you think about it, it's absurd where all galleries are closed on Sunday uniformly, that's when everyone is free and they could actually have the time and the inclination to visit commercial galleries. Now some of them are open in the Lower East Side, but when I was doing these hit and run shows, I would stay open 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. There was seating, there was booze being served and performances, and it was open all the time. And I remember one dealer coming in and saying, "You're open on Sunday? That's dangerous." Like, that's what another commercial dealer said, because I actually made the effort to stay open longer. So anyway, with the Jasper Who, I interviewed people from Harlem to Wall Street, just asking them if they knew who Warhol was, Matthew Barney, various artists, and what their take was just about art, period. This was a British modern artist, Roger Hilton, that I curated a show in the UK, and now I'll do one in LA coming up in the spring. This was an artist who was very popular in the 60s in the UK and internationally. He showed at the Stedelijk Museum, at the Tate, at the Venice Biennale, but he became a very terrible alcoholic, and he was bedridden for the last 5 years of his life. And he was at a dinner where he was honored from winning the John Prize for painting, and he was so belligerent and so awful at the dinner that the man sitting next to him, the alderman, actually keeled over and died in his soup because Roger Hilton was so awful. And that was a headline in the newspaper, "Artist Kills Alderman." But I mean, again, like, he made very, very few paintings in his lifetime because he couldn't get out of bed for the last 5 years, but he made thousands of drawings. And back to drawings, I mean, drawings are such an intimate and a special way to experience artistic output. Now, because I've been collecting stuff for so many decades, I'm having an exhibition called The Hoarder because I just moved from the UK. It took 4 months just to pack all the junk in my house and bring it over. And now I'm going to have an internet-only sale at Sotheby's coming up in December and an exhibition in the UK. Then I've just also made an agreement with Bard College, and they're going to take all of my archives from all of the shows I've curated, all of the articles I've written. And I didn't even think of asking for any money for something like that. I'm just amazed by the very fact that they would want all of this stuff. And for me, it's just, I have letters from all of the artists that I worked with early on, all of the ephemera from exhibitions and so forth. And it's important that this stuff is accessible to people and have another life besides sitting in boxes in my house. Okay, if you weren't bored now, this will surely put you to sleep, cure insomnia, but to the commercial side. So, ever since art came off the wall of a cave, it's been coveted commercially. And there's been more growth commercially in the past 50 years than the previous 500 years in all effects. And then when the money increases so exponentially like it has, so does the bad behavior. So really there's more opportunities to succeed in the art world, in the art market than ever before. Because again, you used to have to, this is about art and money. Art and money have been in bed from the very beginning. That's what people don't seem to understand. I mean, this is nothing new, or the fact that, you can't have a conversation about art today without someone asking you how much, which is kind of sad, but nothing new. So I always say that art and money are always in bed together. They kind of have sex, but they don't sleep in the same bed. So this is Durer. His mom opened up a print shop to sell his prints. He complained about the fact that he could earn more money if he just did prints instead of spending the time to make a painting. But he also was one of the first artists to sue for copyright. And if you look at an artist like Richard Prince, whether you like it or not, his Instagram paintings, etc., he's basically changed the definition of what constitutes copyright, that in fact there is no copyright anymore, and you could pretty much do what you want. And again, it was the phone that changed my entire career, that gave me an audience for my writing and for my artwork. And it's hard to imagine that the iPhone only came out in 2007 and Instagram started in 2010. And literally, this is how we used to go about communicating what we were doing in the fine art context. You'd have to send a sheet of 20 slides to a gallery, and they would hold it up to the light or go in the sun and try to see what the images were you were conveying by snail mail. And I mean, it's almost as if it's another point in history, which it is. Richard Prince, and he has an Instagram painting show now. And I mean, people complain about the lack of privacy in the digital realm, but most of us share so much, so frequently. How could you claim to own a right to something, that you're sticking on Instagram for the whole world to see? If you read the fine print in the privacy agreements with these Facebooks and Instagrams of the world, you don't even own the rights yourself to the works you post, they do. So most recently, Richard Prince, he's in the middle of a lawsuit right now, which will really change. The outcome of this lawsuit can have a tremendous effect if he loses, because he's made these paintings based on people's Instagram posts. But this one woman just came out in Detroit. There's a show in a museum now, and he's able to have the show because none of the works are for sale. But this one woman claimed she was a picture of her in her bra, and she's a feminist, and she was sexually abused, etc. Whatever, I understand and appreciate the situation, and some of this work is obviously pretty sexist, but they asked her if she wanted her work taken out of the show, and she said no. She would rather have it in the show unless every piece was taken down. And in a sense, I can understand both sides of the argument, but as Richard Prince himself said, it's all a free concert right now. And if you're posting all of this stuff, in a sense, I don't really understand how you can claim to have ownership once you stick it out there digitally. It's being sampled the same way music is. back to like the commercial side, I mean, Rembrandt was seen bidding up his own prints at auction. He had the biggest house in Amsterdam at the time. He was a huge collector of the art of his peers to such an extent that he went bankrupt and he couldn't even paint to make money in his own name because his accounts were garnered by the tax authorities. So you hear so much about auctions today, but auctions used to be only for other professionals in the art world. And they used to put rings together and keep the prices artificially low. And then after the auction, the dealers would bid amongst themselves to buy something and keep prices artificially down. And now I'm protecting the identity of these very obvious people. Now they do the opposite where like these collectors own 200 pieces by the same artist, Basquiat, Warhol. And in a sense, like the auctions are where you can see a lot of mischievous, to put it mildly, activity, where now people will bid up their own works for various reasons, whether it's to have one of their clients pay more money, but they do it to increase the value of works in their collection. And then again, like, so this was one of the first times where the beginning of art as a social, like where you're publicly, ostentatiously spending money to buy things. And this was in the UK where people were wearing tuxedos to go to an auction. It's a beginning of art as a social enterprise. And now you have the end of it really with Leonardo DiCaprio having all of these auctions to save the environment and save the tigers. He gets on a private plane, goes to a Victoria's Secret party. Then he gets back on his plane and comes back and does another charity event. It's a bit hypocritical to say the least, but nothing unusual in the art world. And again, like contemporary art, back to the commercial side, you hear like Jeff Koons sold his bunny for $90 million. The first time contemporary art ever ended up in a public auction in an evening sale was in 1973 when the Skulls sold their collection. And it was said that Robert Rauschenberg was so angry that his work went for $90,000 that he punched Skull, the husband, in the stomach for selling his piece because the artist didn't benefit from the sale of the work. And then it wasn't until the 90s where contemporary art made its way into the evening sales, and now it's actually eclipsed Impressionist and modern art. So this, in a terribly flippant and cynical way, this was a guy, when they sold, he collected Jeff Koons and all of these artists like Kiki Smith and Robert Gober, and he ended up going to jail for embezzling. I always say he's like the best collector ever because he actually stole money from Children's Heart Surgery Fund because he had to have the art so badly. And again, like, it's like a terrible thing for me to say, but that was the first time when they took his collection and sold it, was the first time that contemporary art made its way into an evening sale, and now it's become the sort of center of profit in the art market. So back to art dealers and galleries. It wasn't until the first recorded art dealer was in the mid 1400s. There were no galleries for contemporary art. Not until 1831 was there a gallery devoted exclusively towards showing the work of artists. One person shows and helping to fund the practice of artists, and that's Durand Ruel in 1831. And then the whole kind of white cube architecture came about in 1929 when MoMA opened. And like these were the very first galleries that showcased contemporary art. There was Knoedler, which has now been closed down for selling fake paintings. Alfred Stieglitz, a photographer, had a gallery showing painting and photography in 1917. Julian Levy had these great curving walls, and Betty Parsons in 1946. This was a time when there was like basically 5 or 6 galleries in the entire city showcasing the work of contemporary art. And now you hear like more and more, you hear today of a crisis in the kind of mid-level galleries, that small and mid-level galleries are struggling so much today to make a living. But this has always been the case. It's never been easy. Shane Campbell, who's one of the great dealers in Chicago, just closed his gallery, and he's complaining about the fact of the commercialization in the art world, and another dealer in Switzerland. And the fact is that art dealing is about making money. It's never been easy, and it's always been commercially focused, so I don't really see what all the hoo-ha is about. And this was an article that Roberta Smith wrote in 1991 when like 300 galleries went out of business, as opposed to 2008, the last big crisis, where a much smaller amount of galleries closed. But today there was a study in 2016 that there's 19,000 contemporary art galleries across the world. So it's certainly a much bigger enterprise than it is today. Art fairs are another thing that define the commercial practice of galleries today. In the year 2000, there were 50 and now there's 300. But already there's a bit of a shakeup in the art fair world where art fairs are having trouble because there's just too many of them. So some of them are closing and they're going to have to change the way they do business. And this is one fair in Paris called Internationale, where they take over old spaces, and it's a much more creative enterprise where galleries set up site-specific installations in the old residential building in this particular case. That was me in the bathroom of a gallery that actually, it's a small not-for-profit in the UK that's located in the back of a vape shop, strangely enough. Then I made a joke about the fact that there's probably going to be an art fair on the Eurostar coming soon. Now there's so many riots across the world and there's such instability politically, more than I've seen in such a long time in my life. And now there's going to be a Basel Art Fair in Hong Kong coming up, and they won't simply cancel the fair because of the political turmoil for commercial reasons. And the joke is that you're going to need like these anti-riot suits to get through Hong Kong to get to the fair. And when I was just in Paris for FIAC, just a matter of 2 weeks ago, there were riots within like plain view of the Grand Palais where tear gas explosions were taking place and water cannons being sprayed like 500 meters away from the art fair. Now we're in a great, I mean, in a way, like, this is incredible that Baselitz makes these comments again and again, and that the reason that women don't attain as high prices as men at auction is because their work isn't as good. And this really typified the thinking in the commercial context of art for decades and decades previously. And now there's more opportunities for people of color and for females in the art world than ever before, but it's still parity is we're a long way away from parity, although there's been a tremendous kind of opening of the floodgates in this regard. So now you had the Guerrilla Girls in the mid-'80s documenting how little exposure female artists had in commercial galleries and museums. And now you have a reopening of the Museum of Modern Art where they've tried to address this problem and create a whole other interpretation of the modernist canon, where they're trying to show a greater picture that's more inclusionary than the art world typically is. But you really can't be fooled, because to this day, like 90% of the highest prices go to white men, unfortunately. And there's been so many changes. Like it used to be, there's Jerry and Roberta Smith, who write still for the New York Times, one of my very favorite writers ever. The first time I met her, she made me cry because I went up to her and tried to talk about a piece of art, and she looked at me coldly and said, if I needed people to explain art to me, I would never leave my house and go see another show again. And when she left, a tear welled up in my eye and dropped down my cheek. And then like 17 years later, she called me up and I was so scared again, and she said she was complimenting me on one of the articles I had written, and I cried again for a whole other sort of reasons. But critics really used to have this tremendous power when it came to the art market, and they don't anymore, in a sense. Really, the commercial side has taken over, and you have private museums now have usurped so much power from public institutions that it's kind of criminal in a certain sense. I mean, the Rubels, I appreciate what they've done, and I have respect for their collecting. They use it often for commercial developments and so forth. I think anyone should do whatever they want, basically, and there's the Broad Museum. But there was just, I mean, critics have lost their teeth. And the fact is that a lot of these museums have no curatorial scholarship involved in building collections, and they build these collections in 5 or 10 years and open up a museum. And what it does in a kind of zero-sum game, which is where, like, you know, people go to a private museum like this one, which just closed, instead of going to, like in Los Angeles, the LA County Museum of Art or the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA. So the Marciano brothers are the founders of Guess Jeans. They started collecting art 10 years ago and opened this big museum. And in a way, like, again, like, I'm happy that these people put their money into buying art because it helps a lot of artists. But who are they to open this kind of quasi-institution? They get all these tax breaks. They take away the audience from these museums that are run by professional curators and have been around for literally decades, that painstakingly built their collections. And then they open this museum, and it's a bit ridiculous. And then today, the people, 65 people that worked in the museum, wanted to unionize, and they turned around and closed their museum like 2 years after it opened. And good, you know, goodbye. Good riddance to them. I just think it's kind of ridiculous. So, like, I looked up on Google, like, what's a connoisseur? I looked up the word connoisseur, and now I understand what they mean by having a good eye. I always say, like, when it comes to art, you need two good eyes instead of one good eye, but I guess that's where it comes from when you screw your eye up to look at a painting from far back. But with the explosion of the art world, with the kind of exponential increase in the art market, there's been good things and bad things. I mean, you could still find great art at universities. You could still find great art in this city today at some of the young galleries scattered all throughout the city in various neighborhoods. But at the same time, there's been a kind of depressing aspect to it. And like I say on the upper, the animal in the vitrine, it's like if you find a connoisseur, like someone who loves art just for the sake of art, who's never sold a piece of art as a collector, you could put them in a vitrine in a natural history museum. They don't exist. And more the way people buy art is like sheep with their ears, and they find out like who's buying it. Like somebody once said, when it's $5,000 to buy a painting, nobody cares. When it's $50,000, people start to take note. When it's $500,000, everybody wants one. So the only way I could think about it, like again with social media, people have these kind of foreshortened Instagram attention spans, and like the only way I could kind of describe it is like infantilism. When you think about some of these pieces, like our friend Cause, who went to School of Visual Arts in the illustration department, but this other fashion designer sells a Cause painting that's 3 feet square and it makes nearly $15 million. I mean, for $15 million, you could feed a small country, or you could own a Mondrian, a Leger, a Picasso, a Monet, a Manet, a Cézanne, etc. And then, so I was thinking about this situation, and I contacted Cause, and I thought, you know, he's in the in the sneaker world, he started making, he's one of the rare instances where someone like Jeff Koons becomes a famous artist, or Damien Hirst, and then they start commercializing their practice because of their notoriety. And this is the first instance, like in history, that I could think of where this guy is making toys, and then he makes a little toy and thinks, oh, that would look cool as a sculpture. So he becomes a sculpture by trying to enlarge these commercial products that he makes. So then I thought he's so reviled, even by me, that I thought maybe I would just spend time speaking to him and interview him, and maybe I'll learn something. Maybe there's something that I'm missing. Maybe there's something that I just don't know. So I contacted him, and I knew him a little bit through social media. I met him a few times, and I made all of these inquiries to him because I was going to curate a show at the gallery where he shows now, which is Per Skarstad, who shows Martin Kippenberger and various other great artists. And now he picked up Cause because it's such a market phenomenon to help pay all his rent in all probability. And I tried to contact Cause, and he never got back to me. And then I finally said to him, like, I'm just going to show up at your studio if you don't get back to me. And he goes, go ahead, you can interview my door. So I made a little video about that. Hi, this is Kenny Schachter. I'm here at Cause's studio. And though the designer, graffiti artist, toy maker, sneaker designer, clothing designer, painter, sculptor refused to grant me the opportunity to interview him, he was kind and gracious enough to offer me the opportunity to interview his door. Did you come up with the tag Cause? Was it the first name you ran with as a writer?
No, you know, it was probably the second. Yeah.
What was your original?
That's my business.
Often in your work, you reuse characters from SpongeBob and from The Simpsons and from Sesame Street. What is the conceptual meanings of your work?
I kind of like what I'm doing, and I just want to do what I'm doing better because it just gives me complete control. I mean, I could see something and suddenly not like it and kill it, just squash it and not have any second thoughts about it.
What are you thinking about when you're making these things?
Whatever, it put money in my pocket and you make something and it sells. It sort of got me thinking about the world, you know.
So like when I was gonna write an article about him, and I actually watched like 4 hours of interviews with him, which was torture. And after I watched all those interviews, I thought there's nothing to write because he doesn't really have anything to say about his art. He collects some great art, but it was a little bit different in these. I mean, if you look at an artist, I don't care about cartoons in art. You could see that half of what I do is like a comedian on a certain level. But like, when you think of Keith Haring and these things he did, opening a shop, dealing with issues like AIDS and all of these things, and trying to appeal to a greater, more democratic audience, but also having a social message besides selling sneakers, it's a completely different universe. And it's a shame that they sort of get incorporated into the same discourse. Then you have Banksy, which I think is a little bit more interesting, but then he makes, this painting is almost so like childish to like, I mean, to depict a politician as a monkey is such an obvious kind of juvenile thing to do. And then this painting goes and sells for $12 million last month at auction. I mean, so everyone is celebrating this great achievement by him, and then this was my take on it.
Ladies and gentlemen, we move on to the Banksy, the devolved Parliament, lot number 28, signed, dated 09 on the reverse and variously inscribed on the stretcher, private collection. 50,000, 600,000 is Martin's bid at 550,000, 600,000 bid at 600,000 is Martin's bidder at 600,000 pounds, 650,000, 700,000 now, 750,000 is your bid, Alex, at 750,000, 8,500,000. Thank you for your bids. Here at 8,500,000. Fair warning now for 8 million. Sorry. L044. Thank you very much indeed.
I mean, it's sort of like the art world that we live in, a bunch of monkeys. Forget the politicians, it's the people that are driving the prices of some of this stuff. Like a Nara painting just sold for $25 million. There's just no connection anymore because people just don't care. I mean, art, I'm here for 30 years doing this. I've known a lot of you in the audience, Gracie Mansion and David and all these great artists for so many years. And like every day I wake up and learn something, read something. Art is a slow burning process that takes forever to accrue knowledge. And for these people that just want a quick fix, to come in and learn something about art, Kanye West now, everybody wants to be an artist. I mean, again, when I told you when I first started, nobody knew anything about art and nobody cared. It was like the art world had painted itself into a corner to try to appeal to as few people as possible, so it would seem something that you would have no problem spending a lot of money for. Now you have a sculpture by Kanye West that was shown at Blum and Poe, and this was a cartoon that I made where I actually went to a shrink to get some help from my art problems. And he starts talking about the art business. Like he wanted to go help. He goes, did you hear about this Giacometti that sold for $140 million? I was like reaching out for help and he wants to get into the art business. So in this cartoon, he's like, the shrink is asking, what's the matter? And I'm saying I'm having some anxiety. And he's like, should I sell my Christopher Wool painting? And now you have, this is Alex Israel, who, I mean, I don't bemoan any of these people, but they spend more time making scarves, pocketbooks, and sheets than they do in the studio trying to make an art piece. So like Sterling Ruby, another, he's talented, he makes some great pieces and some not so great pieces, and then he starts to complain about some of the very issues that I'm talking about, decrying the fact that art is so commercial and so money focused, and then he goes and plunges full speed into the fashion world, and then he designs a suit that costs $42,000. I mean, it's like worse than art to have a garment that 3 people in the world can afford and they'll buy it and put it in a vitrine and try to flip it at auction. So like in 2016, I was giving a lecture at the Hay Festival because I was in a documentary about the art market, and there were 300 people and they were all seemingly like falling asleep. And I thought, how can I revive the audience? Some of them were like, I thought a few of them were dead. So I mentioned like a friend of mine was involved in this transaction where he sold an Ai Weiwei at Christie's, and overnight the piece got damaged. So they never told anyone and like did a quick fix on the piece, put it into auction, and it was guaranteed by someone, meaning that this art dealer said that he'll buy the piece at, let's say, $2 million, no matter what happens. And if it sells for more than $2 million, he gets half the profit. But if you buy the piece that you guarantee, you get a credit from the auction house. But they don't even report this like on ArtNet. So this guy bought a piece, and then it was for sale the next day for less than it was publicly reported for. It was just this kind of like, corruption or these inappropriate activities. And I mentioned this, little did I know that I thought, I mean, there was one kid who was like 15 years old who was asking these amazing questions afterward, but I didn't realize that half the people in the audience were journalists. So I had a call from like the Daily Mail, which is like the yellowest of yellow journalism, and they were going to make an article about this transaction, which I knew about from a close friend who was involved in the deal, and it would have resulted in all kinds of lawsuits. And I spent the whole night going on the website of these newspapers to find out what, if anything, they were going to write. And then it ended up to be on an entire page in the Times in London, but they didn't mention this specific transaction. And then it was in 5 other newspapers, but luckily they didn't mention the transaction. And the person that had given me the information was a very close friend of mine whose dad is an institutional curator called Harry Philbrick, who was a curator at the Aldrich. And this is a young guy who started art dealing. He studied art at Goldsmiths. And I can't sell a painting for the life of me to a collector, but this guy was so good at selling paintings, he sold one painting to like 5 different people without anyone knowing of the existence of the other person. And this all just came out. Some of it came out today, where if you go to Miami during the Basel Art Fair, this guy is like one of the brightest people I've ever known. And now it's slowly unfolding that he may have stolen as much as $100 million. And so if you go to Miami, to Basel, if you go to the great museum, the Institute of Contemporary Art, you will see this Kusama mirror room of the Pumpkins, one of her most famous signature pieces that, for better or worse, attracts millions of selfie-seeking people having their picture taken in these reflective rooms, which she's been cranking out since the 60s. But anyway, so it turns out the room is being exhibited by the museum in Miami, and there's a finance company in Germany that thought they were the rightful owner. They gave him a loan with this specific piece as collateral, and without telling them, he turned around and sold it to the Saudi royal family, which is pretty rich. So right now you could see the piece. The guy who did this is like, no one's heard from him or seen him. He's on the lam. Another article just came out yesterday about another painting he sold that he sold to someone for collateral. They sold it at auction, and 3 more owners of that same painting came out of the woodwork. And the fact is, like, what you don't realize, like next week in New York, again, like I really think, despite all these terrible tales I'm spinning up here, you really should go and see like the auction previews this weekend at Sotheby's and Christie's and Phillips. You'll see great art. You can get up close, and there's no guards warding you away from it. But when it comes down to art, contemporary art is like nearly a $70 billion business a year. And what I found out through all of these terrible, like hideous experiences that I've had over the last 30 years, like there's no proof of title at all in the fine art market. So like I once sold a Cézanne painting that was like $35 million that was owned by someone I knew in Switzerland. And someone I knew bought it, and the invoice was 1 page that said Cézanne, blah, 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 and no contract, no lawyers, no nothing, and that was the extent of this transaction. But the fact is, no matter how many lawyers you have, it doesn't make a difference. If someone is criminally minded, they're gonna break the law, and this is happening more and more and more. And part of the reason is that it used to be that there's like $1 trillion of art in the homes of people and museums and in circulation, since art was again removed from the wall of a cave and sold. And they just started like in earnest maybe 10 or 15 years ago lending money on art. And now everyone is jumping in because they think it's a quick fix to try to monetize all of this art that pays no rent, that creates no income. So all of these financiers, all of these speculators, like 80% of the people that are buying art at auction, they're speculators. They just think it's like art is an asset class and it's an easy way to make money and to buy and sell, but there are no easy ways to make money. And more you have people like, this is like a joke about maybe the next Basel Art Fair is going to be behind bars in a prison cell. The food may not be as good, but then you have people like Mary Boone is in jail now for tax evasion. There's a documentary which I highly recommend watching. It's called The $50 Million Swindle. The second from the left, Michel Cohn is a French dealer. He actually stole $55 million, but it made for a less snappy title to say the $55 million swindle. So they called it the $50 million swindle. And then he ran to South America, lived for a few years, and then he got caught. Then he was being taken to the hospital because he made believe he had a heart attack, and he jumped out of the ambulance and ran away and got back to France where there's no extradition treaty. And the woman who made this documentary, which came out on the BBC, it's fascinating because after 17 years of looking for this man, she found him. And the most incredible thing to watch was this guy had no remorse whatsoever. And I never really got along with my dad, but he told me something that just resonated in my head, and I never forgot it. And he said, "You could lie to me all day long, but don't believe your own lies," which I thought was pretty incredible. And then you see this guy sitting there, and they're interviewing him because he's living like scot-free in France after he just stole all this money and gambled it away in the stock market. And they said, "You had an invoice to buy this painting, and you sold it to 3 different people, but you never paid for it." He goes, "But I had an invoice." She's like, "But you never paid the invoice." He said, "I was going to." She's like, but then you sold it to all these different people and they all paid you. So you've now sold a painting you've never owned, never paid for, got paid 3 times, lost the money and never was able to give the painting to anybody. And then he said, well, it's not like anyone had to change the standard of their living or change restaurants they went to. I mean, he just rationalized it in his head that these are rich people that are being robbed, so it's hard to get sympathy for these people, and off he lives. This guy on the right, he just got caught last week for like selling fake Warhols and fake German artists and doing the same thing. And I think so all of these companies that are now lending money on art, but a lot of these people lending money, they don't even know what they're doing. So they're just shelling out money to these people and they're getting screwed because they don't even know the simplest way of like how to check whether or not this collateral they're getting is even collateralizable. Okay, so now back to art. Forget all the shenanigans of what's happening in the market. But you know, a lot of the artists that I care the most about have no market. And in a way, like you see cars selling for $15 million and Banksy and all of this stuff, but sometimes to be too far ahead of your time is worse than being behind the time. Because people just want recognizable art that's easy on the eye. Generally, it's still paintings that make the highest prices for the simple reason that it's easy to store a painting in your Freeport, in your storage, or put it on a private plane and move it tax-free from one jurisdiction to another. But you have the work of Vito Acconci, was such an important artist. Besides him masturbating under the floor, he was one of the early proponents of video art and performance art, which you'll hear so much about, and did all of these incredible pieces with photographic work and text. But I mean, his auction record today stands at $78,000. And when he died in 2017, he was destitute. He had no money at all, like nothing. Living in his studio for most of his life with no bathroom even. And this is someone where there's like 5 textbooks about him, and his work is in the collection of most international contemporary art museums across the entire world. He did this piece called Trademarks, where he bit himself and left a trademark in his arm with the pattern of his teeth. Paul Thek, who I mentioned before, he has a sculpture in the new Museum of Modern Art rehanging. I'll drop my speaker again. He was like, he had a group of assistants that he would actually like, today there's a studio practice by all of these artists that I've mentioned that have big markets. They hire a whole group of people to make their art because they're so busy cranking out pieces for all the art fairs and all the commercial exposure they're having. And again, like artists since the Renaissance have used assistants, there's nothing wrong with that. But Paul Thek, these are pieces he did in the 70s, really kind of art that was prescient in terms of how far ahead of its time. He made these incredible meat sculptures, which you see like Damien Hirst putting a dead animal in a vitrine, but Paul Thek would actually make this fake flesh to show, and he would put it into these vitrines that looked like a Donald Judd, or you could see he actually got a Brillo box from Andy Warhol, and inside of it was a big shard of beef, which was handmade with plastic and pigment and various things. That's an incredible piece that he did. And I mean, during his life, Paul Thek was living in Europe, and if he was around today with Instagram and he could have communicated to the world at large these incredible sculptural pieces that he was making, it would have been a tremendous change in his career. But again, like because he was living in Europe, he had a show at Pace Gallery in 1964. Then he went to Europe, and he literally, again, he lived for 20-something years in Europe, and it was out of sight, out of mind. And when he came back to New York in the 80s, he was working in a supermarket, and again, died destitute with no money. And this actual sculpture I curated in a show at Pace in the UK, and we sold it for over $1 million to a museum in The Hague, which was an incredible feat considering only drawings were in, one drawing was in an American museum at the time of his death from AIDS in 1988. That's another installation he did. Here's some, Rachel Harrison now has a survey show at the Whitney, which is up now, and I strongly recommend seeing it. Again, she's an artist whose auction record is like $78,000. It's not very commercial because it's this unwieldy sculpture. This was from the show I curated in '92. Everything in these bags that are hanging off the wall, which they failed to mention at the Whitney, were stolen because it was meant to be a show about ethics. That's the invitation for her show. These are various pieces that we threw away over the years that are now murals at the museum. And then I have 3 of my kids that are here now. I've curated since 2012 7 shows incorporating the work of my children. And the same way in my house, I don't differentiate between a poster, a print, or a painting. it was the same way with the work of my kids. And because they've grown up with art, I never tried to shove it down their throats. Adrian, who's going to be cringing when I mention his name, is finishing SVA, where he's been making art for the past 3 years, and he graduates. He begged me not to say anything, but I just can't help myself. So we did a show, and again, like, oftentimes when you show the work of contemporary artists, people will say, my kid could do that, or anyone could do that, because a lot of times it looks pretty silly. But nevertheless, like, so to try to help the kids think more positively and do things more adventurously, we curated a show together back in 2012, mixing the work in my collection with various well-known artists with the work of the kids and all their friends together. And there was music, we had, again, I was trying to convey a positive lesson to them. Instead of people today, like young kids, all want to be famous or be famous for being famous without actually doing anything. And then, like, towards the end of the show, a Tracy Emin piece accidentally got knocked over, and it was made out of bronze, so nothing happened to the piece, but the little glass vitrine broke. And then she, of all people, like, called the press and said, like, all these kids have a rave and break the art. And then it was in the Telegraph the next day. I was on the BBC radio, and it was in the Pakistan Daily newspaper, and the kids were like, kind of like being famous for doing something awful within their little school community, just the opposite of the lesson that I was trying to encourage them to teach. Then we did another version in 2017 in LA, again, mixing artists that I had worked with over the years. And the idea was to mix like well-known artists with the kids, but the gallerist was so backward, he refused to let me mix the art of my kids with the art of the more established artists, which was the whole point of the exercise. So he made us like put the kids' room off in one room and the other art off in another room. There's a piece by Rachel that's in the Whitney right now. There's beautiful paintings by Paul Tech. And then this was a show that we did in Shanghai in an art fair. There are paintings by Paul Tech, Gerhard Richter from 1969, and Sage, who's sitting here as well. We had a little incident in London where he accidentally set fire to the house and nearly burnt down the entire house, and I wrote about it, of course. And he was known in China because my articles were being translated into Chinese as Fireboy. And I was called the Poison Pen because of my articles. And then just to conclude, on a less happy note, I lost one of my kids about 8 months ago. This was another show of the family. The flag is by Kai. This was a show in London at Simon Lee Gallery, another show in LA, and a show now. These are paintings by Kai, and he just passed from suicide. And he was in Slade. He got into the graduate school at Slade without ever having gone to undergraduate school, and was doing so well with no history of mental illness. And it's very hard, this is the first time I've ever spoken about it, but the point is that the suicide rate, which I just read, is up 56% from 2007 to 2017. And the most important thing in life is to get help for things, to have issues with drugs, to have issues with psychological problems, to reach out and try to get help from people. Because these family shows that we do together is kind of the fabric that holds the whole family together, and it wasn't enough. I thought it would be enough. But the most important thing is if you're suffering in any way, to really try to just reach out to help, whether it's not your family, your friends, or professional help. There's medications that can help. There's a lot of things to do to have, instead of taking that particular route. Sorry about that. If there's any questions, if you're too tired or bored, you can get my email from David, and I encourage anyone to get in touch. I'm accessible, I'm around, and I don't just say that, I really mean it. So you can follow up at any point now or 2 years from now. Contact me, ask me something. I'm happy to give my advice in any way that I can.
I was wondering if you had any comments on the dealer Jeffrey Deitch. He seemed to go to the museum and go back to private dealing. Also often worked in installation or project-based work, so I was wondering your impression of him.
Well, I have one personal anecdote about Jeffrey Deitch, who I'm working to maybe curate a show in one of his spaces. But it was an incredible story where he was a commercial dealer, then he went to run a museum in California, and then he got thrown out of LA, basically. People were so against him, and he did some questionable things, like he did a show with street artists, and he incorporated like some movie people like James Franco, where like Kanye, who said he would trade 2 of his Grammys to be taken seriously in our world, which thankfully will probably never happen. But I'll never forget, like I once tried to do a deal with Jeffrey Deitch, and I meant to leave a message on his answering machine, and I called him up in the summer at 10 o'clock at night to leave a message on his machine, and he picked up the phone in his gallery, and there he was, and he had this tiny little office, and he was working away. And like I said, like with all of the good things and the bad things that I've experienced in my life personally and professionally, with this young guy that even stole money from me, it's all coming out. It's going to come out in the next couple of months, the extent of what he did. And this was someone I trusted, someone I cared about, but he screwed me. And the fact is, like, Jeffrey loves art. And even Gagosian, you could say a lot of terrible things that Gagosian would take the fillings out of someone's mouth who was lying on the street to melt them down. But you can't, Larry Gagosian has done some of the best shows that I've ever seen in my entire life. He did a Brancusi show. He does shows that museums can never muster. And the fact is that nobody, like, again, like no one, if anyone who thinks they're going to go into, a lot of people that are trading Kondo, George Kondo and KAWS and all this stuff, they think art history started with George Kondo. And the fact is that you can't be a Gagosian if you simply wanted to make money. It doesn't work like that. You have to spend your life learning about the history of art and about you can't just get into it commercially and expect to succeed. Not Jeffrey, not these people. These people have dedicated their entire lives to art. And that shows in the quality of, like, Gagosian had John Richardson, who passed away recently, one of the great Picasso scholars, and they did shows. They kept him on a payroll for $500,000 a year to do like one show every 5 years. And some of these, like the museums are so strapped for cash because some of these like asshole private collectors are squirreling away all their resources to make these museums and not giving their money or their collections to real museums. So their galleries that are able to do institutional quality shows because they have the financial wherewithal and the flexibility to stage these shows. So I think Jeffrey is a hardworking, serious person who really cares. You may not agree with all of his choices, and some of them are more commercial than others, but these are people that have been sticking to it and have been in the business for 40, 50 years.
For us artists, if we choose path of scholarship rather than commercialized art, are we doomed, or is there a compromise?
If you pursue like more public funded art.
Art that has scholarship, like...
More academic oriented. Yeah. I mean, the thing is you're doomed no matter what, basically. But at the same time, there's nothing else that I would rather be doing. I mean, on top of all of these things that have happened to me, again, like every day I wake up and I look forward to reading various websites. Again, you could send me an email and I'll give you a list of websites I look at every morning. And whether you do art that's non-commercial, that's more installation oriented or more technology oriented or video oriented or more geared towards public art or academically oriented, there's more ways to do it today than ever before, because the art world, I mean, again, like back to this, I just moved back here after 15 years and I have to come into like Donald Trump land, and every time I turn on the TV, there's an ad for a pharmaceutical company. I mean, it's unbelievable. I forgot about it because in the UK, healthcare is free. So there's no commercials for pills. Now every single commercial on television is for pills, and at the same time, globalization is a great thing when it comes to art. And there's such a mixed crowd of people that's in this room tonight, and I think that the interdependence of various countries is a great thing when it comes to fine art. And as a result, there's grants that you can get, there's more institutional and international opportunities to show work of all different stripes than ever before. So it's not going to be easy for you if you're doing work that's more esoteric. Like if you look at someone like Paul Thek, and these are artists that are, in major museums today all over the world, but like Vito Acconci still has no market. And he's had retrospectives at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, in England, in Germany, in Spain, all over the world. But he died with like $5 in his pocket, no more, nothing. He just had a show at PS1, Museum of Modern Art, just a few years before he died, a few years ago from now. And again, like it's never going to be easy, even if you're commercially oriented, because one day you're in fashion and the next day people change their mind. It just, people are so fickle, and the art world is just I'm optimistic, like I said, but you just have to persevere. And if you want something hard enough, the opportunities are there and you can most definitely attain it, but it's just not, you have to prepare yourself for the fact that it's not going to be easy, whether you're painting a canvas or digging a hole in the ground somewhere.